Back in 2019, I worked the night shift at a small, rundown gas station on Highway 41, just on the outskirts of a dying town. It wasn't glamorous, just a way to get by. I had dropped out of high school at 17, had no real plan for my future, and the gas station was my latest stop in a long line of dead-end jobs. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't exciting either. The job was simple. I manned the counter, stocked shelves, cleaned the bathrooms, and made sure the pumps were working. The only real danger was the occasional carjacker or junkie looking to steal something small. It was a quiet life. Until that night, I clocked in at 10 p.m., the usual routine. The previous shift guy gave me a lazy wave as he clocked out, and I was alone again in the dimly lit store. The air was stale, with the smell of gasoline and cheap coffee. I grabbed a mug, poured myself some, and settled behind the counter. 20 minutes passed without a single customer. It wasn't unusual. The highway was quiet at night, and most traffic came through in the day. Then, just as I was about to check my phone, the door opened, and the bell above it jingled. I looked up, expecting a late-night traveler or maybe a trucker. Instead, a man in a gas station uniform walked in. I straightened in my chair. "Can I help you?" He smiled, a little too wide for my liking. "Yeah, I'm Danny. They sent me here to train with you tonight." My gut twisted. There had been no mention of a new hire, no call from the manager about a training shift. I hadn't seen a note or schedule update either. But then, Danny added, "Spoke with Sarah, your manager. She said you'd show me the ropes." Something about his mention of the manager's name, Sarah, made me pause. The way he said it felt natural, as if he had this whole routine set up with her. I didn't have any reason not to believe him. She was the manager, and he did look like he belonged here, even though I had never seen him before. "Right," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I didn't know we had someone new, but okay, I'll show you around." I led him through the motions, stocking shelves, cleaning, and going over how the register worked. But Danny wasn't exactly absorbing any of it. He followed me around like a shadow, barely speaking. Whenever I asked if he had any questions, he just shook his head, eyes fixed on me with an intensity that started to unsettle me. Around midnight, I stepped outside for a cigarette. The air was cold, the kind of crisp chill that made everything feel sharper, more real. From the corner of my eye, I saw Danny sitting at the counter through the window, his back to me. But then I stopped. He wasn't just sitting. He was staring at the monitors. No, not watching them. He was staring at the cameras themselves, like he knew exactly where they were, and he was waiting for me to notice. I couldn't shake the unease in my chest as I snuffed out the cigarette and walked back in. When I came inside, I caught him watching the break room. He wasn't just looking at the area, though. His gaze was fixed on something inside, as if he were waiting for something to happen. I swallowed hard. "You good?" Danny turned to face me slowly, too slowly. He didn't say anything at first, just gave me that wide, unsettling smile again. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice a little too soft. I tried to shake off the weird feeling as the night wore on, but Danny's presence was like a shadow hanging over me. I couldn't concentrate. I kept noticing little things, like the way he would just stand still and stare at random spots in the room, or how he never seemed to blink. I thought it was just my nerves, but every time I turned my back, I could feel his eyes on me. Around 2 a.m., the door chime jingled again. I looked up, and for a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But no, Danny was standing at the door, staring outside, his hands clenched at his sides. Danny, you okay?" I called out. He didn't move for a few seconds. Finally, he turned to me. His eyes were wide, almost frantic. "Do you ever feel like someone's watching you?" My heart skipped a beat. I froze, unsure of how to respond. "What do you mean?" He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he muttered, "Never mind." The tension in the air felt suffocating. I excused myself to the break room, trying to calm down. When I came back, he was gone. I didn't see him again for another hour. By then, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. But as the clock ticked past 3 a.m., I checked the security monitors again. Danny wasn't behind the counter anymore. He was outside, staring into the darkness beyond the lights of the gas station. I leaned in closer to the screen, my heart thudding in my chest. I could barely make out his figure, tall, thin, standing perfectly still. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. His face was turned away from the camera, but there was something about his stance that made my skin crawl. He was too still, too rigid. Without thinking, I grabbed my jacket and walked outside. I didn't want to, but the silence was gnawing at me. "Hey, Danny," I called out, stepping onto the cracked pavement. He didn't move at first. "Danny!" I repeated louder this time. He slowly turned his head, but not enough to face me. His eyes were wide, almost wild, and his lips curled into a small, unsettling smile. "Yeah?" he asked softly. "What are you doing out here?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. Danny didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly took a step backward, his gaze fixed on the dark woods just beyond the station. "Do you ever think about what's out there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stepped closer. "What are you talking about?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he turned away from me and started walking toward the trees, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "Danny!" I shouted, but he didn't stop. I stood there for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. It was too quiet, the night too still. Then, against my better judgment, I went back inside and locked the door. I spent the next half hour watching the monitors, trying to keep my mind focused. But every few minutes, my gaze would dart back to the outside cameras. Finally, around 4 a.m., I called my manager. "Hey, Danny never came back inside," I said, my voice shaky. She was silent for a moment. "Who?" she asked, sounding confused. "Danny, the guy who was supposed to be training with me tonight." There was another long pause. Then she said, "We don't have a new hire named Danny." My heart dropped. I turned toward the counter, and there it was, the uniform Danny had been wearing, neatly folded. But there was no sign of him anywhere. I checked the outside camera again. The last frame of Danny was from when he was walking toward the trees. And then, nothing. I didn't stick around much longer after that night. I called in the next morning and told my manager I couldn't come back. The whole situation had messed with my head too much. Within a few days, I was transferred to another location. A bigger station off the highway, one where the night shifts weren't so isolated. They had more staff on at night, and I wouldn't be alone. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that Danny was someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget the way he stared at the cameras, like he was waiting for me to see him. I can only hope that wherever he went, he stayed out of my life. In 2018, I was working the night shift at a gas station just outside a small town. It wasn't where I thought I'd end up, but life has a way of throwing you off course. I had just turned 25, and my plans had unraveled fast. I dropped out of college after my second year, mostly because of money. Student loans stacked up, and my part-time job wasn't enough to cover rent. My dad had left when I was a kid, and my mom was the only one keeping us afloat. When she got sick, I had to step up. After she passed, I was lost. I bounced between jobs, stocking shelves, washing dishes, before landing at the gas station. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. The night shift paid more, and I didn't mind the quiet. The station sat along a highway, with nothing but fields on one side and a stretch of woods on the other. Most nights, it was just me, the hum of the refrigerators, and the occasional trucker passing through. I had seen my share of weirdos, drifters, tweakers, people who talked to themselves, but nothing, not even the worst nights, prepared me for what happened that October. I remember the air was colder than usual. It was late, around 2:30 a.m., and business had slowed to a crawl. I was leaning on the counter, half watching the security monitors, when I noticed something. The cooler door was open. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes customers didn't close it all the way, and I'd have to go shut it myself. But what caught my attention was the wet footprints leading inside. They started just past the entrance, dark smudges against the white tile, trailing toward the cooler. I frowned. I hadn't heard anyone come in recently. The bell over the door hadn't chimed. I scanned the monitors again. Parking lot empty. No movement in the aisles. I called out, "Hey, we're closing soon." No response. I sighed and grabbed the mop from the back. I figured some drunk had wandered in, grabbed a beer, and was now passed out in the cooler. Wouldn't be the first time. As I walked toward the cooler, I noticed how deep the footprints looked. Like whoever made them had been soaking wet. The thought made my stomach tighten. Had someone come in from the fields? There was a small creek beyond the trees, but why would anyone be out there in the middle of the night? I reached the cooler door and hesitated. The footprints disappeared inside, but I couldn't see past the rows of drinks. The light inside flickered slightly, probably the old bulb struggling to stay on. I gripped the handle and pulled the door open wider. The air inside was freezing, the smell of chilled plastic and stale beer hitting me instantly. I stepped in, my shoes squeaking against the wet floor. My breath puffed in front of me. "Look, man," I said, moving between the shelves. "If you're back here, you gotta go." Silence. I turned the corner, expecting to see someone crouched in the back, maybe shivering, maybe drunk. But there was no one there, just the cooling fans humming above. I frowned. The footprints led inside. There was nowhere else to go. I checked behind the stacks of beer cases. Nothing. The cooler had one exit, the door I had just walked through. A shiver crawled up my spine. I backed up slowly, my eyes darting to every corner. My own reflection stared back at me from the glass doors leading to the store aisles. And then, the cooler door slammed shut. The light flickered hard, buzzing like a dying fly. I jumped, spinning toward the door. My breath caught in my throat. Through the glass, I saw a figure, a man. He stood just outside, his face obscured by the glare of the overhead lights. For a split second, I thought it was my own reflection. But then, he moved, his hand pressed against the glass. My stomach twisted. I hadn't seen anyone come in. The monitors had been empty. The bell hadn't rung. I reached for the handle. It wouldn't budge. The man's fingers tapped the glass. Once, twice, slow and deliberate. My pulse pounded. I could see him more clearly now. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his bony frame. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then he tilted his head. I knew that look. Predatory, curious, like he was waiting to see what I'd do next. I slammed my palm against the glass. "Hey, open the door!" His expression didn't change. He just stood there, breathing slow, watching. The light flickered again, and for the briefest second, his face became clearer. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, lips cracked and blue, like he had been out in the cold for hours or longer. I stumbled back, my breath clouding up the glass. I reached for my phone, my fingers were numb, shaking. But before I could dial, the light went out completely, pitch black. The humming of the fans stopped. And then, a whisper, right next to my ear. I spun, my back hitting the glass. My own ragged breathing filled the tiny space. No one was there. The darkness pressed in. I felt movement, a shift in the cold air. Like someone was standing right next to me. The cooler door burst open. I stumbled forward, gasping as I nearly fell into the aisle. The store lights flickered back to life. The humming returned. The man was gone. I twisted, scanning the empty store. The footprints were gone, like they had never been there at all. I backed away slowly. My head was spinning. I checked the monitors, nothing. I checked the lot, empty. But I didn't clock out. I didn't even lock up. I just grabbed my keys and walked straight out the door. I never worked another night shift again. 2 weeks later, I quit, and I never went back. A year later, I heard about a body found near that gas station. Some hiker stumbled upon it deep in the woods, not far from the creek. No ID, no missing person report, just a man half buried in leaves, like he had been out there for months or years. But the detail that got me, the police said the body was wet when they found it, even though it hadn't rained in weeks. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. A few years ago, I was driving long-haul routes across the country, spending more nights on the road than at home. I was used to the loneliness, the dark stretches of highway, and the occasional sketchy gas station, but one stop still haunts me. It was past midnight when I pulled into a small, run-down station off a rural highway. My rig was running low, and I had been driving longer than I should have. There were no other cars at the pumps, just the glow of the flickering neon sign and a lone pickup truck parked near the side of the building. Inside, the place was as empty as the lot. A single cashier, a young woman, stood behind the counter. She looked up briefly when I entered, but her eyes darted past me toward the back door, like she was expecting someone. The radio played faintly from a speaker near the register, but otherwise, the place was too quiet. I grabbed a bottle of water and a bag of beef jerky before heading to the counter. The girl scanned my items, barely looking at me. 75 on pump 2, I said, sliding a few bills across the counter. She took them, but didn't respond right away. Her fingers trembled slightly as she keyed in the transaction. That's when I noticed it. Her right hand was gripping the counter so hard her knuckles had gone white. "You all right?" I asked. She nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just..." She glanced toward the back door again. "It's been a long night." I wasn't buying it. Something had her spooked. I turned slightly, scanning the store. Empty aisles, nobody near the door. But then I saw the security mirror mounted in the corner, reflecting the storage room behind the counter. And there, partially hidden behind the supply shelves, I saw a shadow move. Someone was in there. The girl saw me looking and pressed her lips together, almost like she was pleading with me not to react. My skin prickled. I kept my tone casual. "You got a restroom?" She hesitated before nodding toward the back of the store. Around the side. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the door. The moment I stepped outside, I inhaled sharply. The air was thick with diesel and something else. Sweat, maybe. Something human. I took a few steps, angling myself so I could see through the store's side window. The girl was still at the register, standing stiffly, her back to the storage room door. Then, just as I expected, it creaked open. A man stepped out. He was tall and lanky, wearing a dirty hoodie with the hood pulled low. His face was gaunt, sunken eyes darting toward the counter. One hand was buried deep in his pocket. The other held something dark and metallic. A gun. I didn't think. I just moved. I stepped back inside, letting the door slap shut behind me. The man flinched, turning his head toward me. His fingers twitched on the grip of the gun. "Hey," I said, voice steady. "Let's not do anything stupid." The girl sucked in a sharp breath. The man's grip tightened. "Who the hell are you?" His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. His eyes flicked to the girl, then back to me. "Get out of here." "Can't do that." I took another step forward, hands loose at my sides. "You don't want to be doing this." His breath was quick and uneven. Up close, I could see the signs. Sweat dripping from his temples, fingers twitching, pupils blown wide. Junkie. Probably hadn't slept in days, and now he was desperate. "You think I won't use this?" He lifted the gun slightly, but his grip was sloppy. Unsteady. "You might," I admitted, "but that's a risk you don't want to take. Cops get called on stuff like this. You think they won't be looking for you?" He sniffed hard, glancing toward the girl again. She was frozen in place, wide-eyed. "Just give me the cash," she snapped. The girl hesitated. I could see her hands shaking now as she reached for the register. The moment her fingers touched the buttons, I moved. I wasn't a hero, but I'd spent enough years driving long haul, dealing with truck stop fights and roadside drifters. I knew one thing: most people with a gun didn't actually want to shoot, especially junkies. I lunged, grabbing the barrel of the gun and twisting it to the side. The man yelped, his grip weak from exhaustion. The gun clattered to the floor. He staggered back, eyes wide with panic. For half a second, we stared at each other. Then he bolted. He crashed through the front door, nearly slipping as he hit the pavement. His pickup roared to life, headlights flicking on, and then he was gone, tires skidding against gravel. I exhaled, only then realizing how tense my muscles had been. The girl was still standing behind the counter, hands pressed to her chest. Her breathing was shallow, eyes locked on the spot where the man had stood. "You all right?" I asked. She nodded, then let out a shaky laugh. "Jesus." I bent down and picked up the gun. Empty. Figures. I set it on the counter. "Who was he?" I asked. She let out another breath, rubbing her arms. "Some junkie, I guess. We get him sometimes. Most just steal a few beers and run. This guy..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "You need to call the cops," she swallowed, nodding. Yeah, I will." I could tell she was still rattled, so I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. "I'll wait with you till they get here." She gave me a grateful look. "Thanks." We stood there for a while, the store eerily silent. Outside, the highway stretched on, empty and dark. The night was quiet again. Too quiet. I glanced at the front door, half expecting the guy to come back. He didn't. But that didn't mean he was gone for good. And for the first time in years of driving, I didn't want to be on the road alone.